a much stronger international agreement. So when we talk about norms and standards and values and objectives, I'm going to make this assertion that you'll never be able to manage your borders if you don't have that set of international framework to work from. It helps people manage the border. And all those demagogues who are out preaching the idea that we can handle this ourselves, stay away, it's all in our hands, are simply sort of tilting with the windmills. The very definition of refugee and migrant is they're moving across borders. They're not sort of self-contained. And one of the things, by the way, is a digression. In our larger report, we are going to make a real effort to try to get the international communities and the international organizations to start paying attention to internally displaced persons. Again, something that we saw very, very much as a reality in the countries we visited here in the hemisphere. But you realize that there is virtually no framework in which IDPs can establish identity, anchorage, belonging, or some sense of who they are. It's really, and we're talking tens of millions of people who aren't people anymore because nobody recognizes them as being a human being. So those are the things that we have to bring into the fold. One further comment, because I think it is important. We don't expect that there is going to be a burning bush that will all of a sudden light up sort of the White House, the Quai d'Orsay, wherever Viktor Orban hangs out, whichever rock in the Budapest River he's involved with. What has to happen is a series of incremental, significant changes that build upon each other. And one of the areas that we believe strongly, and it's replicated in this report, and if we could get serious public policy attention, we think we could really build a momentum. And that is the opportunity that's at our disposal to do two important things. One, to hold bad guys accountable, people who steal money from their own citizens and bank it away, for future flowering. And there's hundreds of billions of dollars now sitting in the project. Enough project here in Washington can tell you a lot where that money is. We're saying it's about time we went after it and turned the bad guys' money over to help the victims that they've created. And that means reallocating frozen assets to a point where they can be redirected to support refugees, to support IDPs, to support other kinds of building blocks and development. If we can get several countries to accept that particular kind of commitment, not only will you result in a new flush and flow of significant funds, but you're also going to take away one of the bases of impunity that many of the warlords of this world think they can get away with. Because once they lose their treasure trove, what's the point? So I would hope that that's an area in terms of your own examination and discussion you come back to, because I think that's one of those breakthrough issues. Systems theorists will say if you can only find one small lever in an otherwise reasonably static system and pull that lever, then you can begin to change the whole system. We think that that's one of the levers that we have. It's in the report. We'd certainly like to see people in this hemisphere take it on as a real commitment and do it together. Thank you very much. And with that, Eduardo next.
I'll turn to Eduardo next. Thank you, Minister. Dr. Stein, Minister Axworthy mentioned the sense of urgency attached to this issue, and one reflection maybe of that sense of urgency was the appointment by the United Nations of a special representative on the issue of Venezuelan refugees and migrants in the region, and they were wise enough to choose you for that role. You're now a few weeks into the job, so how do things look, and what is your assessment of the role the UN is playing on the challenges that Fen laid out, that Minister Axworthy laid out? What are your plans and ambitions for your new role as special representative?
I'll start with the ambition first, because we had never, ever seen in our hemisphere a phenomenon of these dimensions. And saying this has dire consequences in many areas of how governments, mainly from the receiving countries, can organize themselves to react effectively. But also at the international level, in which Lloyd Axworth spoke about, how do we revise our conceptual frameworks and our procedural practices, which have shown to be quite short to handle such a phenomenon of people outflow from a single country that is not at war. In this regard, I would like to stress first and foremost the initial solidarity of the neighboring countries, which has been extraordinary. They've relied on their own budgets. They have organized themselves the best they can, first on an individual basis, but growing rapidly to be convinced that there is indeed a dire need of a regional response. This regionality, if I may speak that way, was first drafted in technical terms in a meeting in Quito a couple of months ago. There is expected to be in 3 weeks a second meeting in Quito, which will hopefully provide better operational agreements amongst receiving countries. Thirdly, one of the issues that has proven to be quite cumbersome is not only how to deal in emergency terms with the influx of people coming out of Venezuela into the neighboring countries, but how to set the proper criteria to balance out human rights obligations that all of the countries are quite aware they have because of the international mechanisms that they adhere to, with security issues. This is a very delicate balancing act. When you think that, for example, during the month of August, which was perhaps the highest outflow registered, it depends who's counting, but the records show that at some point there were days of more than 18,000 people a day crossing just into Colombia. I insist on this because one of the difficulties within each and every one of the countries is their own legislation. Sometimes, I hope I'm not offending anybody, but sometimes our legislatures, our asambleas legislativas or our congresos do not have the kind of sensibility and practices to deal with these issues with the speed that they should and with the all-encompassing systemic view that they should. They tend to react more within a parochial perspective, within agendas that are perhaps too near their own particular interests, and they don't have the practice of going outwards, outside of their own domestic agendas, and try to factor in these regional needs. Fourthly, within this vision of the need for a systemic approach, for a regional set of responses, and for balancing the humanitarian agendas with security agendas, one crucial issue is how to document the people that are coming in and how to decide on quick, operational, fast, simple ways of doing that, and yet guaranteeing not only the internal security demands that security outfits within each country are pressing the presidents or the foreign ministers or the immigration officials to keep enforcing, but because of the protection of the very persons, families, and groups of people that are coming out into the receiving countries. Without a proper identification process that has to be swift, efficient, and quick, there is an enormous amount of difficulties, practical difficulties, to put in place protection schemes to protect those that are migrating. And in a fifth dimension, no pun intended, the way in which we have to rethink our conceptual frameworks, in which there was a very sharp international division between what was a migrant and what was a refugee. Governments have encountered an almost unsurmountable difficulty in the processes to document and approve status of refugee. In most countries, it takes over a year of processing through the bureaucratic channels, and governments were admitting some rate of 5, 8, 10, 12, 25 at the most cases per year. And we are talking thousands per day, many of which are applying immediately to refugee status because of the reasons that impel them to leave, or at least the way they are arguing those reasons to be objectively impelling enough to leave. So governments are trying to find a way of a temporary type of processing status or permits that will allow them to access to work opportunities, to health services, etc. Because in many countries, most countries, once they get into the process of applying for refugee status, they cannot work. They do not have access but to a limited protection set of services, etc. And lastly, we have found that the governments, in their haphazard way of reacting to something that they were not prepared for. No government was prepared for something of this magnitude and complexity. They have encountered very particular ways of tapping into their own internal budgets, which they are already exhausted. And in this regard, they have encountered two thorny and complex issues to deal with. One of which is of immediate political consequences for each receiving country, and that is populations, internal populations that are in need, groups of people that are looking for better working options, that are within the category of poverty, or even worse, extreme poverty, react with immediate jealousy on all the attention that is given to the incoming migrants. And they have come to resent the type of attention and the kind of resources and the emergency responses allowed to the Venezuelans coming in, and not enough attention to these needs that are in some areas and countries age-old. So what we have found is that in this effort to devise ways of urgent money-getting procedures because of the urgent needs of the emergency, there is also a need to devise a way to balance out the type of emergency aid to those coming in and direct investment into the well-being of the receiving communities, mainly in the next phase of what this entails. We have found that most Venezuelans coming out are not intending to go back anytime soon unless situation inside Venezuela changes dramatically. So governments are preparing themselves for relocating the Venezuelan migrants into communities that can indeed not only accept them, in which they can fuse within the local populations, but getting them as rapidly as they can close to self-sustaining economic activities. So going back to where I started, what is my ambition? At first, when I traveled to the borders of the three main receiving countries, I wanted to just hide away because of the unsurmountable set of challenges that were confronting the receiving countries. But the way in which local populations have reacted, as well as the way in which governments have reacted, is a very solid ground for hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stein, for the injection of hope. Betila, let me turn to you. You also are quite new in your role as co-coordinator of the OAS working group to address the regional crisis of Venezuelan migrants and refugees. I acknowledge your co-coordinator here, David Smolansky, in the front row. So Dr. Stein talked about I think and very, very rightly, the solidarity that we've seen among especially South American countries towards Venezuelan migrants and refugees. It's a point that I think is prominent in the report. But he also talked about the emerging challenges in both conceptual frameworks and procedural practices. You've been traveling around the region. You've been meeting with government officials, with diaspora groups. You've been sort of getting a ground level view of these challenges. What does it look like from your perspective? And perhaps you could react to both the analysis and the diagnosis in the report, but also some of the recommendations on how to respond and how some of those may square with the plans of the OAS working group that you lead.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone. So I guess I should start by acknowledging and commending the dialogue and CIGIC for the report. I think it's just provides this sense of urgency to the situation of the Venezuelan migration crisis, and these efforts are strategic to bring the conversation where it needs to go at the regional level. As you probably know, the Secretary General Almagro, at the beginning of September, at the same time almost that the countries were meeting in Quito and approved this declaration, he created a working group to address the migration and refugee crisis of Venezuelans, and appointed David Smolansky here with us and myself as leaders of this group, with two specific mandates. On one hand, we must prepare a report that provides the full scale of the crisis, and in this regard, there's a lot of information, and of course, we always relied on the official numbers that IOM and UNHCR provide. but we also want to bring together and to converse in one report all the data that is out there, other numbers that may not account for previous waves of migration of Venezuelans that happened in the early 2000s in 2015. And also we want to assess the needs of Venezuelans as well as the receiving communities and the receiving countries, and provide recommendations in terms of what policies could be adopted to address the crisis. Our second mandate is to work on fundraising efforts, and I see that the report actually makes mention of the role that the OAS can play in terms of bringing an international donors conference to bring to support what's already being done in terms of fundraising. Before the establishment of the group, both David and I had the opportunity to visit the border of Colombia, between Venezuela and Colombia, as well as Brazil and Venezuela. And myself, I just returned from a trip to Chile and Peru. And it's very evident, of course, that we have two types of needs: the short-term needs that Venezuelans have in terms of health, food security, and those types of more humanitarian needs. But we also need to start thinking about the medium to long-term needs Venezuelans are confronting and how the receiving countries are going to address it. I think the report makes a very good case for in terms of the short-term needs and the specific types of responses that are being given, and also already points out in terms of some of the gaps that are in that respect. It also makes a very good systematization of the options for regularization for Venezuelans that we are already seeing, and of course, how to reconcile this tension that Dr. Stein already mentioned in terms of the legislation that must keep the balance between a securitization of this phenomenon, as well as ensuring the protection of human rights of the populations that are being displaced. Of course, we need to go into depth in terms of each of the countries. For instance, today we're sitting here, and today is also the last day that the Permiso Temporal de Permanencia, el PTP, the temporary residency permit in Peru expires. And so we're going to have something happening tomorrow, and I know there's some efforts that the government of Peru is considering in terms of other options, and the diaspora in Peru that's very well consolidated and doing a lot of advocacy in this regard is already moving forward with this. But, we have to also take a look in terms of what's happening in each of the countries. I also really appreciate the discussion that the report does in terms of what also Dr. Stein mentioned, the conceptual frameworks and the juridical frameworks that we are actually using to address this crisis. For all of us, we talk about migrants, we talk about refugees, but there's this more expanded definition of refugees that the Declaration of Cartagena gives us, the 1984 Declaration of Cartagena, that we actually need to start thinking more of. And I think there's a pending agenda at the regional level in terms of considering other options or more flexible options in terms of defining, and the situation of nationals of the Northern Triangle have given us demanded this expanded definition, and now this displacement crisis of Venezuelans also does. On the numbers, I also wanted to point out the report uses the 2.6 million Venezuelans that is being currently reported by IOM and UNHCR, and we also need to put the lens a little bit further on these numbers. If we go by the UNHCR account of 5,000 Venezuelans living per day, we're talking about that by the end of 2018, we will have probably 3 million Venezuelans in other countries of the region. And this is not minor, right? It would put Venezuelan as the second largest displacement in the world after Syria. And we're not talking about a war situation or a civil conflict situation. We're talking something that is man-made. With regards to challenges, I also like the discussion in terms of what's, again, as I said, the short-term needs and also the options for regularization and what countries are currently doing. I wanted to stop on the issue of identification and corroborating the identification of Venezuelans. And as you know, Venezuelans have a very hard time accessing passports, and they have a very hard time accessing cédulas de identidad, the identity documents. And there's restrictions in terms of where you live, and also what's your age, because, for instance, minors cannot access a cédula until they're like 9 or 12 years old. So it was a very good step. I always say that it was a very good step that the countries in Quito agreed to accept expired passports as a way of proving identification. However, from the conversations that we've had with people in Colombia, with people in Chile, with people in Peru, this is not really happening in practice. Because there's other things that are being asked of Venezuelans. For instance, did you request a renewal of the passport? Can you show me proof? So, this idea of how it's really taking place at the more basic level and the points of entry of Venezuelans, be it airports as well as border passings in between the countries. So I think we have pending, and the report touches on it, but we need to just push us further in terms of thinking of common identity protocols and some other forms of registering Venezuelans that can ensure that there's coordinated information among the countries. And also, again, trying to reconcile this need to ensure security as well as the human rights of Venezuelans. There's, as I mentioned, the huge problem with minors, niños, the children that are, most of them travel with parents, but a lot of them also are traveling with third parties, some uncle, somebody that is taking them. But the fact that they don't have IDs makes them prone to be victims of trafficking, human trafficking, and this is something that at least the authorities in Chile were mentioning is very important, that the countries from the point of where the Venezuelan starts the journey all the way to the south have a way to coordinate information for minors, and this is something that we're not really talking about, but I wanted to bring to the discussion. And the idea of the need also to check for criminal records, because a lot of the countries to provide visas or some other form of regularization require the Venezuelans to provide proof of a clean criminal record, and this is very difficult to get in Venezuela, as you know. So I think it's a very good practice what's being done in Peru, where they have coordinated with Interpol for Interpol to provide with a very nominal fee proof of proof of criminal record to the regularization process to continue. Two other things that I think the report touches on, but we also need to keep discussing, and this is the common denominator from country to country, from Venezuelan to Venezuelan, is the need to work. This is actually, of course, related to the more medium to long-term integration of Venezuelans. Some have had the possibility of accessing a work permit, but a lot of them have not. You mentioned that it's 6 months in some cases. From the time the person applies for the work permit and the moment that he or she receives the permit. And here we have, in some cases, I visited a refuge in like an hour and a half from Santiago, where you have doctors, lawyers, graphic designers, nurses that are doing nothing because they have no possibility of going, getting a job, and they're even willing to distance themselves from their academic degrees and work in something that will help them provide. They're very appreciative of the solidarity of the communities that are receiving them, but they are ready to become economically independent, economically autonomous. And two interesting facts that I want to mention. Of course, I just came back from Chile and Peru, so I'm using the data from this trip. But in the case of Chile, very interesting to a recent profiling that was done. 80% of the Venezuelans that are there have an academic degree. 80% of those who are in Chile have an academic degree and are of working age. So this is talent that is not being taken advantage of, and this is something that the Chilean government is already thinking how to tap into, how to take advantage for the actual benefit of the country. And in the case of Peru, 7 out of 10 Venezuelans, of the almost 500,000 Venezuelans that are in Peru, also have a profession, and 7 out of 10 are under 35 years of age. And this is a registry that was done by the diaspora group that is very active and actually doing a lot of things for Venezuelans in the country. And the third thing I want to mention is the issue that was touched on, the issue of xenophobia and discrimination. I want to stress that both on the part of governments, at least from the observations that we've done via the working group, on the part of the governments of the region, as well as the communities that are receiving Venezuelans, there's an important sense of solidarity with the situation of Venezuelans that are leaving the country, not because they voluntarily want to leave, but because they have no other choice to provide for their families, to provide for themselves. However, there have been instances of xenophobia. You know, in the media we saw the issue in the border with Brazil, where they burned the belongings of Venezuelan migrants and refugees, and we also have I always say the pasivo-agresiva, the passive-aggressive forms of xenophobia, unfortunately, where Venezuelans apply for jobs and they are not given those jobs, or, you know, where they go to rent a place and they are not granted this possibility. So it's been studied. The reasons for discrimination and xenophobia, of course, have to do with the particular political and socioeconomic context, cultural values, and the third that's been mapped out as a reason for this is the potential competition for jobs, and that's why I link it up to the issue of accessing work permits. This has to not just provide working permits, but we need to regionally think of options for the actual effective labor inclusion of Venezuelans in these receiving communities, precisely not just to have them be economically empowered, but also to prevent forms of xenophobia and discrimination. And I have data that was collected by the Catholic University of Peru, the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. They are doing surveys of Venezuelans' perceptions on xenophobia in 12 cities of the region. And they say 30% of Venezuelans interviewed have suffered some form of xenophobia or discrimination, and 90% of them think it's because of their nationality. And there's different forms of violence that these 30% have been victims of, that include verbal violence, physical violence, and in the case of women, and this is something that we need to also start bringing more to the conversation, and I really like that the report brings it, which is the issue of women. Sexual violence against Venezuelan women and how they are being also prey of criminal networks in terms of prostitution and that type of issues. And there's also issues related to the schooling for migrant and refugee children, the issue of recognition of academic degrees. Again, we're talking about at least more to the more south you go, the more educated, the more professional, and the younger the profile of the Venezuelan migrant and refugee. So we have the issue of how to ensure the recognition of academic degrees and the proper inclusion in the labor market. Again, the issue of women, we need to talk more and then bring it more to the conversation. I think I would leave it at that in terms of the challenges, and we can continue the conversation.
Terrific. Thank you, Betel. That was great. Andrew, let me turn to you. The issue of the Cartagena Declaration has come up a couple of times, and you know, on the one hand, there is this. There is the Cartagena Declaration. Most of the countries that are kind of major recipients of Venezuelan migrants and refugees have signed on to the Cartagena Declaration. In fact, a number of them have actually incorporated it into their domestic law. One of the things we did in the report was actually go and look at the national legislation, and it's a pretty positive picture at the sort of normative level. In practice, and I think Dr. Stein alluded to this, the institutional kind of practical frameworks and infrastructure for applying the declaration are less strong. That said, you know, you could almost point to kind of a spirit of Cartagena, the willingness of major destination countries to put in place these kind of ad hoc, improvised, temporary, you know, all the qualifications you like, but very real pathways to normalization, registration for hundreds of thousands, approaching 1 million Venezuelans now in the region, is significant and should not be overlooked. And so I wonder if you could just give us kind of your balance, you know, what do we, in terms of Cartagena and what it means and how it's being applied, and you know, where we stand, where we might be going, and what needs to happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. By the way, great report, Fen and Michael. I mean, really lots of nuances that you really captured in this. And I think, a lot of great things have been said here. I think we shouldn't miss what Eduardo said early on, that this is, and you said as well, Michael, this has really been in some ways a positive news story. I mean, and I will matizarlo, I will take that back in a second, but it has been a positive news story compared to what we've seen with migration flows around the world, right? I mean, this is, what we are, the debate we're having in this country, the debate that is happening across the Atlantic, it tends to be mostly on the restrictive side. Here there really has been a notion of solidarity with people who are coming in. The overwhelming push has been, how do we take people in? And national legislation has largely been very creative in trying to do this. And I think normatively, it would be, for those that don't know Cartagena was the Cartagena Declaration in 1984. The idea was Latin American countries that agreed to this were looking at how to broaden the refugee convention and sort of look at a more expansive way of defining refugees, right? And Latin America would have a more open view of refugees. And this would be the perfect moment for all the countries to declare that Venezuelans all meet the standard of the Cartagena Declaration. In fact, Sahil and Wola convened a group of civil society groups that recommended that. I commend their report to you. It is, normatively that makes sense. In reality, we know how politics plays out. We're sitting in Washington, D.C. I mean, the reality is no government wants to constrain its hand by saying, I'm going to take in everyone. Right? So no one is doing this because they're sensitive to political pressures and they don't want to have to backstep afterwards and say, oh, wait a minute, I didn't mean it. Right? So declaring that Cartagena applies to everyone, and there are ways depending, as in any agreement, and the way it's been incorporated into international law, which is of different levels of imperative in each country. There's some ambiguities, but once you say that this applies to everyone, it's hard to take it back. But what has happened, I think, is that you have seen the spirit of Cartagena, as Michael said, really applying, and Minister Axworthy said this as well early on. I mean, that really has applied in some ways in how countries have tried to find lots of other legal avenues to let people stay and bring people into legal status. And I think it goes from before that. I mean, I think there's a history from the military dictatorships of the 1970s, then the Central American refugee flows in the 1980s, which generated Cartagena, the Colombian flows in the 1990s and early 2000s. I mean, there's a history of this in Latin America. I mean, in some ways, I always think that Simón Bolívar was a better social theorist than he was a political theorist. I mean, the notion of creating Bolivarian unions has never quite worked as, political architecture, but it did actually, this notion of solidarity in Latin America is a social construct that exists in people's minds. So I think that's useful. And Cartagena is both a product of that, and it is one of the things that has allowed countries to think creatively. And I can't stress enough how important legal status is here. I mean, legal status, the ability to put your children in school, the ability to access health care, the ability to not only have legal status, but legal status with work authorization, what Betile was saying. These, for our Latin American colleagues, please avoid the mistakes we make in this country. I mean, we're a country that has 11 million undocumented people. You don't want to end up with that, right? I mean, and I think the good news story is that most of the countries have been pretty assertive so far in trying to avoid that from happening because it generates unintended outcomes. The more you make people give people the ability to integrate into the local communities where they arrive, in terms of work, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare and basic services, the more likely you're going to have long-term really good outcomes. And it's hard to see this right now because there are a lot of short-term costs of a migration and refugee crisis this fast. And we shouldn't, by the way, underestimate this. There really are costs to this. I mean, this is not, countries are picking up the tab for lots of services, for adding people to schools that are already overburdened, to healthcare facilities that are overburdened. There is competition for work in some places. The long term, this is likely to work out pretty well. In the long term, immigration is probably going to be good for the economies if people have access to integrating, but that's only going to happen if the legal status issue is taken care of. But I would add, and Batilde covered a lot of this, the devil's in the details on a lot of this, and the report is really good on this. A lot of people probably should be applying for asylum. I thought this was one of the great insights of the report, actually. A lot of people should probably be applying for asylum because they deserve it. right? And even if you're not going to apply Cartagena, a lot of people would qualify for asylum, but asylum systems are so overburdened, right? That it's not a good pathway in some countries for people to get in, right? And so people should have protections under asylum. They deserve it. But there are other statuses, temporary statuses, that are just easier to access, because what you need to do is get a job now to feed your family, right? And so the product of not, the devil's in the details on how you design your asylum system and your immigration system, and these systems are completely overburdened. And in general, Latin American countries haven't had to think about their immigration systems, right? I mean, these have been, with a couple notable exceptions, these have been flows that have been manageable. This is sort of the moment of reckoning of trying to think about how you construct immigration systems that are coherent, that function. How do you resource an asylum system and think through an asylum system that can handle this number of people coming through? And by the way, have to mention Mexico, that processed 1,600 new asylum applications last year, which would be about, they processed 14,000 all of last year. So this is also happening in other places with the Central American flows. Happening in the United States to some extent. Well, I'll come back to at the very end. Final point, I think, is that there's an issue of how you move, and this has been hinted at has been said by everyone in some way or another, how you move from temporary to permanent. And right now we're in the moment where we're thinking about this, of how do you deal with a temporary crisis and not a permanent crisis. And by the way, there's things in the temporary that still need to be taken care of, the asylum system, the immigration system. The devil in the details, the idea that you can get legal status, but you can't work for 6 months, or you can get, through the Mercosur visa, you can get into a country, but you can't get the permanent Mercosur status because you don't have your criminal record, which happens in one country. There's a lot of things like that are happening, right? Where if you could just fix it slightly, you could tweak the temporary part, it would work so much better, right? Because not working for 6 months is impossible, which means people then go into the underground economy. But there is also the question now of how we begin to pivot from temporary to permanent, and how we begin to think that there are, that a 2-year temporary permit, even renewable one time, as is in a couple countries, is not going to be enough. That this is a population that's likely to stay, and the more you give people pathways to permanence, and you can put rules on them, right? You can certainly make sure, that people don't commit crimes while they're in your country and they stay employed. You can put some rules around there if you need to. But how you begin to hold out those pathways to permanence matters in the investments that people make, right? People are going to be more productive the more that they know what their future looks like. And so this is the moment to begin moving also from the temporary to permanent discussion. The discussions in Quito, I think, have been important. They've been referenced. They, among other things, I think, allow thinking about common standards, which is key. What are at least minimum standards? And the report makes good reference to this. Actually, I think it's a key part of the report, is saying there should at least be common standards. By the way, there's nothing more frustrating for migrants and refugees than trying to figure out a myriad of crazy laws that are different from country to country as they're figuring out what to do. But it also, I think this is a good news story. I think there's been an attempt to try and keep some common standards, at least on entry, right, on entry documents and keeping the door open, but also beginning to think of common standards perhaps on integration, right, and common standards on legal status, even stopping short of Cartagena, right? Even you're not going to declare what are the minimum standards that countries should do to try and bring these people into a legal status where they can integrate into their home communities. It was said, and I think it's key, the question of investments, not just in the immigrants, but also in the receiving communities. Integration is a two-way process in multiple ways, and I know Tony from the IDB talks about this. Is the importance of not just saying, let's set up schools for migrants, but let's set up, how do we, in the areas that have a lot of immigrants and refugees, how do you invest in the education system? So it benefits both the immigrants as well as the people who are there, right, and invests in integration processes so that people don't end up getting segregated along the way, right? And by the way, it's really easy, a parenthesis, but an important parenthesis, it is really easy to forget sometimes that other Latin Americans are immigrants. We've been dealing with this a little bit on sort of Mexicans returning to Mexico, Central Salvadorans returning to El Salvador. People forget they're often immigrants, right, because they come from Mexican, Salvadoran families, but in fact have grown up in a different world. Here, the same thing. Venezuelans are kind of like Colombians, but they're definitely not Colombians, right? And so thinking about the same things that we know about integration in the education system, the healthcare system, and residential housing that we think about in other contexts, even though people speak the same language, and there is this sense of solidarity. But I think it's critical thinking about how you actually think about investing not just in the immigrants. That's needed in the emergency moment, but as we switch to permanence, it's how do you begin to lift everyone up, because otherwise it does become divisive. And there, I mean, something Batilde said also, the accessing the diaspora, I think, is important. There's some good experiences where the diaspora and governments are working together. Argentina, for example, there's a really good conversation going on between diaspora groups and the government on job opportunities. You know, I mean, trying to get people who are dentists and veterinarians out of Buenos Aires and get them to places where they need dentists and veterinarians. You know, this is in many cases a highly educated population. Let me just add one coda here, because this is not in the report and it's not directly our discussion today, but something for us all to keep on the radar is that most of the action is in Latin America and will probably continue to be in Latin America. But as we were looking at the census numbers, one of the things we noticed is that there was an increase in about 96,000 Venezuelans in the United States in the past year. That's a lot. Okay, that is more than the visa numbers and the asylum numbers would suggest by a lot. So this is a flow that's coming to the United States. It's still mostly an educated flow, mostly a professional flow, people who already have connections here. They have family and friends, maybe business opportunities. So it's not being noticed, and they're settling in places where there's already, you know, people who are Venezuelan origin and are permanent residents and citizens. We're not noticing it, but it's going to happen. It's going to increase over time. Venezuelans are the #1 group doing affirmative asylum claims. I think that is mentioned in the report in the United States. So this is happening in the United States as well. This is not for those that are American. This is, we should look at Latin America and see what they're doing right, which is a lot, actually. I mean, we can actually learn a lot from what Latin Americans are doing, but we should begin to think also about how we respond to this in terms of the United States, because it's an issue that we're going to be grappling with as well more and more.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrew. That was great. So lots here to discuss. I want to, before opening it up to the audience, I know there's a lot of people here that have been working on this issue, and I'm sure you're ready with questions. Maybe we'll just do a kind of a lightning round of follow-ups with our speakers. And Dr. Stein, maybe I'll start with you. And just, you know, one of the things that's come up has been the tendency towards making the requirements for entry, and especially for regularization, stricter. The report talks about a potential kind of race to the bottom as countries that can restrict migration do, and those that can't because of geography are left to kind of carry a disproportionate share of the burden. Batilde mentioned the issue with the PTP in Peru. Is it tomorrow? Today? So, I mean, from your perspective, what can the UN, what can you as special representative, how do you sort of try to tackle this challenge of evolving normative frameworks in a way that averts this race to the bottom?
Part of the mandate implies helping receiving governments or governments of receiving countries precisely to agree on common procedural practices, in most of the time ad hoc models. They do not want to wrestle with permanent legislation just now, because they see it as impossible in the short term. But yes, there are some reactions by the security outfits in each country to try to strengthen the security requirements of the flow. And I would say amongst the different countries, perhaps the one that is most worried about that is Colombia, which is the one that is receiving the largest numbers, because they still have two armed groups that have not demobilized. And they have a long history of drug cartels operating in illegal frameworks throughout all of, not only Colombia, but all of the neighboring countries, using the Central American corridor as an illegal corridor. So I would say that, yes, there is a tendency to stiffen the requirements But I would say, in favor of all of the countries, from what I've gathered, there is also a division within each government that it's not only occurring in Andean countries. I see it here in Washington as well, between, let's say, people from State Department, which has a worldview quite different from, let's say, other security outfits. Also, an element to take into consideration is the cultural framework within which this is occurring. It was mentioned already, but I want to stress it. Venezuela was a receiving country just a few years ago, when Colombia was experiencing the stiffness of the internal guerrilla warfare in guerrilla groups that were associated with criminal drug cartels, something which didn't happen in Central America. But I would end the comment by saying we are confronting a hemispheric phenomenon that goes well beyond all of our classic intellectual frameworks. I don't know if to go Platonic or to go Aristotelic, but in both cases, we are confronting disenchantment by large sectors of the population with our own democratic governments and practices, which is really worrisome. Just to give you an example of my own country, most youngsters culturally and emotionally have already migrated. The moment they can leave, they will leave. So it is a cultural attitude that shows a resentment of the situation in which they normally live within Guatemala, within Honduras, within Salvador. We have the crisis in Nicaragua, and yet, as Andrew underscored, the experience we're seeing in the Andean countries and other receiving countries is quite positive if compared to others. Governments are not sending 5,000 troops to the border to impede the flow, as another country is doing.
We'll leave it nameless. Minister Axworthy, one of the striking things for me in the Council was the degree to which you talk about accountability. It's a word that comes up a lot in the human rights context. It comes up less in the humanitarian context, in the refugee and migration context. And you, I think, through your work at the Council, have really positioned it as part of the conversation. So I want to ask you generally about how you kind of conceive accountability in this context, and then specifically in the case of Venezuela, how that concept might be applied. I think Betilde mentioned this is not it's not a war situation. It's not a natural disaster situation. We are dealing essentially with the second biggest forced displacement crisis in the world, resulting from failed policymaking and criminal conduct by the leaders of Venezuela. So maybe you could take the general conceptual framework that you've developed with the Council and help us understand how it might apply to the Venezuela case.
I think accountability is something that runs through every step along the spectrum. It begins with those who are responsible for creating the disruption or the conflicts or the violations that cause movements. And right now, our security systems are quite incapable of managing them. Security Council is paralyzed. There really aren't effective forms of response in most regional organizations. There's great capacity for passing resolutions, very limited capacity for actually beginning to hold people accountable. I don't mean to say that you're landing troops all the time, but I mean, I did go through the experience with the OAS, where we intervened in Peru on a democratic issue. And there was a good example where it was a soft power intervention from the OAS to help create what was becoming a major crisis that would have had regional implications. But there was action taken. And I think that there is issues here about the action taken. But right now there is a sort of Alphonse Gaston kind of mentality. So let somebody else do it. And so as a result of the accountability for those who take actions, which is one reason, and I think, I hope maybe some of you will come back to it. But one of the reasons why we put a lot of emphasis in the report on taking measures that would require accountable actions, such as the freezing and dispensing of assets of those that are acquired through criminal activity, which can be drug cartels, they can be purloined money from warlords, you name it. There's a lot of people who steal from their people, and they dump the money in some other, in a variety of banks and financial institutions. There's a whole network of professional systems that support the kind of movement of that money around the world. It is very large in its scope, and we need to find ways to start putting a hanger on that so that there isn't certainty that if I've stoked away $5 billion in a bank in Montreal, that 10 years later, my family can sneak back and get it out. There's got to be a way in which we put a clear sense that if you are going to sort of harbor ill-begotten gains, they won't be there when you get there. They will be transferred and assessed to be returned to the people who have been victimized by your actions. That could be talk about a morality of accountability. You pay for your sins. I mean, lots of religions have adopted that. This is practical. This is not some kind of, abstraction with quantum economics. It's a simple matter, to use the old political science standard, sort of go for the money. And if you go for the money, you can create a lot of different reactions. And that just simply takes some simple acts of legislatures or governments to first implement sanctions and then also give their court system the right to have the courts determine how that access can then be distributed. So, those are things that all of a sudden send signals and messages. I think there's a third element, and if I might be allowed, Michael, just to put one of the ideas we are looking at the World Council, really sponsored by the high degree of enmity and division in Europe between Eastern Europe and the older European Union, about resettlement. Right now, we've talked about two things on this one. Sort of money. Well, we know right now that UNHCR has only 1/3 of its budget, with 2 months to go in its fiscal year. Where's the money going to come from? Because all the things we've talked about takes money. Not massive sum, it takes money. The money isn't there right now. And it's all temporary, ad hoc, and voluntary. I keep saying it reminds me, when my son comes for a contribution, to support the local Halloween dance at his high school, sure, I can raise a few bucks. What's loose change in my pocket? But it's not a continual assessment in which there's a stability of flow that governments can count on. And I think governments who are bearing burdens are getting ticked off that those of us who should be caring or sharing those burdens are not doing so. There's a real resentment has grown up in the southern part of the world, where most refugees sort of land because of the nature of the volumes, that there is not burden sharing. There is not a recognition that we're all in this together. And that's disappeared from the narrative. about we're back into how do we resettle, how do we manage, I think, which are all, even to get an employment pass, a Nansen passport to go back to the First World War, is going to take money. And if you don't have access to it, so that's got to be one of the things. And you've got big IFIs here that Eduardo's working with, but it's debt financing. Southern countries don't want more debt. So what are you going to do? Those are the things that we've got to put our heads to in the think tanks and in the policy centers and in the governments and in the civil society. How do you get that accountability based upon the flow of money? One third thing, and I think this is a hard gas for a lot of countries in the Americas, and that is to start going into peer review systems, where you, as we're now doing in the field of sustainable development and in Human Rights Council, that countries are going to be required to report. And if the report stinks, then you get named and shamed, as you properly should. Now, is that easy to do? No, because I went through the OAS exercise. But in the Peru example, there was a mechanism set up by which you could do a due procedure. It wasn't sort of ad hoc, it was a due procedure. And those are the things to come to grips with. And I'll make one final point because Eduardo mentioned it. We have to get our eyes on the horizon on this issue. The immediacy of it, as you said, is overpowering. But what follows could be catastrophic, because you're now looking, at the latest UN reports of people having to flee large sectors of their home centers because of climate and environment. That if you're living on an ocean coast in a large city, then in 10 years, you're going to move. You're going to go somewhere just to escape, unless you can build enough seawalls. Well, the Dutch figured a way to doing that, but they're a country of 7 million people. So I think that over the horizon issue, and here is the point I make. You talk about, Eduardo, about people losing trust and confidence. One reason is because we're not very good at solving the issues. They expect people in government and in positions of responsibility to solve them. We've lost our capacity, really, to be able to say, we can make this work. And I think that if we can find the right combinations of partnerships and alliances and networks and to put things together, both in the regional level and then as it connects, then you're going to show, at least in this area, that those with responsibility are exercising it and coming up with an effective system. If we don't do that, it's just going to be, to my mind, you're going to really have a global mass society with no trust in anything. But if we can handle this, we can say, see, we were able to make it work.
Terrific. Thank you. Just in a couple of minutes, perhaps, Betilde, I want to come back to the issue of diaspora groups. Both you and David are prominent members of the Venezuelan diaspora here in Washington. I know you've been, as you mentioned, meeting with diaspora groups as you travel around the region. How should we be thinking about the Venezuelan diaspora, both in terms of formulating policy and then in terms of actually, responding to the continuing flow of Venezuelan refugees and migrants?
Excellent question on the role of the diaspora. Of course, we have to differentiate in terms of the diaspora that has left Venezuela a few years back and is already settled and with very, or at least, let's say, a comfortable financial situation, and we need to count on them to provide funding for the short-term humanitarian relief efforts. But this same diaspora that has been in these receiving countries for a while also has a lot of potential for advocacy, not only because of the conditions that they're in, versus the more recent flows of migrants and refugees that come with very precarious socioeconomic conditions, but also because you find in a lot of the countries that there's a lot of political active leaders. I don't know, from at least the 4 countries, and I know in Argentina is also the case, we have people who were involved in politics somehow. In the case of Chile, I believe there's 6 magistrates of the Supreme Tribunal in exile. In the case of Peru, there's a very active former parliamentarian working along with others, and they have a very good capacity of hacer interlocución, no? To connect with government authorities on behalf of the Venezuelan community, that migrant and refugee community. And just to give you an example, in the case of Peru, but also in the case of Argentina, it is because of the diaspora that they've been able to think of these assimilation plans, and they call it Plan de Asimilación Productiva, or versions of that, where they map out Venezuelans with professional degrees and coordinate with the government where to send these migrants and refugees to areas where there's not a lot of psychologists, or where there's not a lot of nurses or a lot of doctors. So the diaspora definitely has a role on this. And also there's a very short window of opportunity for all of us to know where Venezuelans and which Venezuelans are in which countries, because we hope, I mean, at least I'm Venezuelan, so I want to know where they are and who they are. So when the time comes for a transition, we can count on this capital, human capital, to reconstruct and bring back Venezuela to what it used to be. And then also the issue of entrepreneurship, just the fact that if you're a migrant and you took the risk of going to another country, that makes you a lot of, like, a risk taker, let's say. And a lot of Venezuelans are hungry for these types of opportunities. The diaspora can also support these types of efforts and provide seed funding, for instance, to Venezuelans who have the capacity to do this type of endeavors. And then lastly, one of the things that I've also been hearing from Venezuelans is the need to sort of protect the values and traditions and preserving the culture. And in that regard also, it's very important to also count on the diaspora to ensure that the children who are in Colombia or in Peru of Venezuelan parents not only know the Colombian national anthem, let's say, but also the Venezuelan, just to provide an example. So it's very important also in that regard.
Great, thank you. Andrew, the U.S. has been raised a couple of times as a destination country for increasingly for Venezuelans leaving the country. I want to ask you about policy. The issue of immigration has been in the news. There's a caravan you may have heard of that comes up occasionally. But is I guess the question I think would be how do you assess the U.S. response to the Venezuelan migration and refugee crisis specifically, and to what extent do you think that the issues surrounding the border and Central American migration shape or influence or impact the U.S.'s ability to be a player, an effective player, in some of these multilateral conversations that we've alluded to?
It's interesting. We have very little awareness of the Venezuelans coming here, and my colleague Jessica Bolter corrects me, by the way, 96,000 is the number of Venezuelans in the last 2 years, 2015 to 2017. It was a 2-year jump, not a 1-year jump, but it's still a very large jump in the United States. We have very little awareness of this happening in the United States. So first of all, to say it has been a non-issue, right? I mean, we're immensely focused. We're likely to see the president come out and give a speech today about the border and about Central Americans. I don't know if it's scheduled. It was supposed to be last night, got postponed, about how we're going to harden the border and the 5,200 troops going to the border, and it was announced a couple days ago. I mean, so it's interesting. Our attention on our own internal immigration policy is very focused right now on Central Americans, who are actually a very small piece of U.S. immigration, by the way. And we're not paying it at all internally attention to Venezuelan flow, except that they're a big deal in the asylum system, actually. But it's not received public attention. I do think we're at a time, Michael, where the U.S. could really be leading on this issue. This is an issue where the U.S. has a clear national interest in helping Latin American countries receive Venezuelan immigrants, both because of democratic governance issues, right? Making sure this does not become a backlash, making sure that things happen in a way that the countries can absorb people. But frankly, from us, also make sure that you don't have people trying to cross the U.S.-Mexico border, which we have not seen yet, by the way. I mean, almost no indications so far that there are smuggling networks of Venezuelans from South America up through Central America to the U.S. Does not seem to have happened. But, if you're the U.S. government, this is something you would want to be paying attention to, both from the democratic governance angle and the humanitarian angle, but also from that very self-interested angle. And I think at a time where the U.S. is seen in much of Latin America, where the U.S. government is seen as having taken a very hard position on immigrants from Latin America, and perhaps a position more extreme than we've seen in recent years, it's hard for the U.S. to have as visible leadership. Doesn't mean the U.S. can't be helpful, particularly in financial terms, and the U.S. has been playing a role. I mean, I think we shouldn't minimize the fact the U.S. government is playing a role in this, and particularly in the humanitarian crisis, and is helping financially, and is certainly engaged. Some would agree or disagree with constructively or not, but on the solution within Venezuela, which is the source of this. But the U.S. does not have the same moment of leadership that it could at a different moment in really standing up and being part of this discussion. And I think, and Minister Axworthy referred to this earlier, I mean, I think that is a problem, actually. I mean, I think that is, we're not willing to be quite as generous as we're expecting others to be. That undermines our ability to take leadership. At the same time, we are being helpful, but perhaps not leaders.
Terrific. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. There's a lot on the table. So with the time we have left, I'd like to take maybe 3 questions to start, and then we'll come back to our panelists. Please introduce yourself, and if your question is directed to a particular panelist, please mention that. We'll start in the back here.
Thank you very much. This is Carolina from NTN24. I want to ask you about Jair Bolsonaro. He, newly elected president of Brazil, he stated a few weeks ago he will shut the border, but he's not going to do it, but he is keeping his intentions of creating refugee camps in the border, like the ones we have in Lebanon, Jordan, or Turkey for the Syrian refugees. So, checking your conclusions, you mentioned that one of your important points or conclusions is you want to integrate incoming Venezuelans. How does it work if you create camps with the fact that real recommendations suggest they should be integrated in Venezuela? So my question, more precise question is, are you fearing that the new elected president is going to lay out policies that contradict all your conclusions? Thank you.
Patricia Fagan, Georgetown University. I really congratulate this panel. Those of us who've worked in refugee or forced migration issues for many years will see in your presentations the collective wisdom, the best on lessons learned through the unfortunately long history of tragic forced migration, and likewise for diasporas. But the question I ask is the one that's puzzling all of us here with regard to Central Americans. It's puzzling Europeans with regard to the migrations from Africa and the Middle East, and certainly which, according to Batilde, is the subject of positive steps in many of the countries on behalf of Venezuelans. But temporary status, well, there are two issues that come out. One is, what kind of status can be accorded that goes beyond the permanence of asylum and refugee status? What can be done? And the second is, how can this be meshed with a regional approach so that all the countries are sharing in the burdens? Well, the question that bedevils all of us is, what kind of temporary status, what kind of humanitarian status is the best idea for the Venezuelans, because we're talking about Venezuela, but I think the answer will apply to many other groups. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to this side of the room. Any questions over here? All right, well, let's come back here. Yes, sure.
Cristina Burelli, V5 Initiative. I'd like to focus on the last conclusion, hold Venezuela's leaders to account. And some of you have touched on it, but I mean, I remember clearly a few months ago we were debating in this room whether or not there was a refugees crisis. So typically, you know, the international community is reactive and not proactive. What I'd like to know is whether you have ideas on how to hold the Venezuelan government accountable in stopping the flow. I mean, I don't see anything that's going to be stopping the flow at this point. In fact, it would seem that the Venezuelan government is pushing people out by denying food, medicine, and just making conditions unlivable. And this is only going to get worse. So do you have any ideas on that?
Let's take those 3. Maybe we'll start reverse order. Start with you, Andrew, and we'll come down this way with our panelists.
Let me just, well, I guess, too, on the question of the Brazilians, I mean, I think ideally you want people to be integrated into the places they go, particularly because these are not people that are going back soon, most likely. I mean, look, I'd love to be wrong about that. I mean, I hope that changes, but for reasons we know, it's unlikely that people are going back soon to Venezuela. And so leaving people in camps for a long time is not a good idea. Also, leaving them in the neighboring states to Venezuela may not be the right idea. I mean, this is, an issue both in the north of Brazil as it is in the south of Mexico, right? I mean, there are job opportunities. Brazil has been a country that's been enormously generous on refugee resettlement, including with Syrians. Brazil has enormous capacity to actually integrate people coming in, but further south, right? I mean, where the jobs are. And so figuring out ways that you move people to where jobs are and provide them legal pathways makes a lot more sense than sticking them in refugee camps that will become a sore that festers. On Pat's question, I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, on the Venezuelan crisis, I think making the asylum systems a bit more robust would certainly help, because there are people who qualify for asylum that are not, clear open and shut cases that aren't applying because it just takes too long right now because the systems are overburdened. But what we've seen in Latin America that I think is positive has been this granting of temporary status, with the eye to permanent status. And the question is, can you create the pathways into permanent status? And can you make sure everyone can get temporary status? And then getting temporary status means you also get work at the moment you get it, right? I mean, you get a work permit. So it's those details still matter. I see that as less likely in the United States, since you asked the question about, I see it more likely in Mexico, which actually was very active in the Cartagena Declaration and feels somewhat bound to this. Mexico is, I think the new Mexican government is looking at ways they can do this with Central Americans and think about going beyond asylum. Mexico, in fact, has something called complementary protection, which is sort of a step beyond asylum. But they're also thinking other legal pathways. I think with the United States, frankly, we're gonna, at this point, we would be lucky to be trying to save our asylum system as it is in a robust way. And I think, frankly, it is unrealistic in the U.S. to be arguing for sort of letting everyone in. The question is, can you make distinctions that are rational about who is fleeing from violence versus who isn't? And that's a tough question.
Thank you. On the question of Brazil, of course, on the side of the OAS, we're more than willing, open to work with the new government on how to ensure this migration crisis is addressed in the best possible way, and of course, always with a human rights perspective. I will mention that the issue that Brazil has a very progressive legislation in terms of receiving migrants and refugees, and this, of course, is the framework with which the new authorities will have to operate, and hopefully it will be preserved, and hopefully it will be strengthened. And in the case of Brazil, not only do they have they already have shelters administered with the cooperation of UNHCR, but they are also working on something they call the interiorization plan de interiorización, where they take Venezuelans and they place them with a sort of accompanying families in other cities of Brazil, and where the labor market is more robust and they can find some sort of integration. So this is proving to work. It's proving that it's already working. So hopefully this is something that will be maintained. On the question from Patricia from Georgetown University, what kind of status can we think of? Of course, from the OAS, we understand very well how much respect we need to give to countries in terms of their sovereignty in deciding which frameworks to use. However, from the working group, we've been discussing the possibility of, given the atypical situation that Venezuela is is making countries confront, also to think of flexible options for status, and maybe a temporary residency status like some Central Americans have received in the U.S. could be, I'm not saying exactly like that, but something like a model to be adopted by other countries in the region. But of course, this is a very extremely political discussion, and what we hope to do from the side of the OAS is to spark that discussion and hopefully agree on some common issues that this status protection can guarantee. And on the question of holding Venezuela government accountable in terms of stopping the flows, I think I agree with you, Andrew. The flows are really not going to stop in the short term. And I think for two key reasons. One, we already have 2.6 Venezuelans out. We'll probably have 3 million by the end of the year. And the issue of family reunification and who you know, who can receive you in the receiving countries is proven, empirically researched. That is one of the causes for continued migration patterns. So that's one thing that's going to make these flows continue. And the second thing is that as long as some level of political and economic normalcy return to Venezuela, the flows will continue. Even if that happens this year, it's still going to take some time for this normalcy to return. And as long as this doesn't happen, the flows will continue. So the report does, I think that's one of the beauties of the report, the issue of how to prevent impunity and ensure that there's accountability in terms of what's causing the flows.
Thank you. Minister Ashworth.
I'll be short about it. I'm not an expert in Brazil. I have, however, met a lot of terrible leaders in my time, of which he seems to be well apprenticed to perform. Some of them much closer to us than Brazil. The only answer we have to do is that to go around, short circuit, and develop a high degree of cooperation and affiliation with those governments and those institutions and those private sectors who do believe that there has to be a collective will established. It's so much easier if everybody was on side. I was the immigration minister of Canada for 4 years under what we call Papa Trudeau. Gives away my age. But we at the time had a coordinated group of 15 countries that were able to manage the flow of close to 2 million boat people in the early 80s. And a combination of resettlements, investments in home countries. But it was always based that we were collaborating. It wasn't sort of each person for themselves, because we realized if we got into that kind of beggar thy neighbor, it was going to collapse. But it also generates some interesting innovations. In our own case, and I'll just pause, because I think it answers some of the question about temporary status. If you came to Canada, you could become landed if you had gone through the system. Once you're landed, you're totally eligible for health care, education, all the same rights as a full citizen. And where you weren't, if you were coming in as a worker, as a temporary status, as a child care worker, if you worked for 5 years and didn't commit a crime, you were automatically eligible for landed status. So there was a pathway out. And for long periods it worked. I think the government, Mr. Harper's government, kind of boshed it. I mean, there's a kind of a right-wing view about people that's crazy. So that people who you would invite somebody from the Philippines to look after your child, but they couldn't get around to sort of saying that maybe they could become a citizen too. That's just kind of that silly thinking that takes place. But I think there's a lot of temporary status bases in which, but I think here's where it's important, not just for the right to work, but I think as someone said, the identity issue of being able to have access to health care. And just to simply have a name that's on a piece of paper that registers that you are an officially recognized person. I did a study, by the way, for the OAS when we were working on Peru, and found out that in any election, there was 3-4 million people who didn't vote because they weren't on any voters list. And it had a huge impact on the outcomes of elections. So there's those kinds of things in terms of governance, democratic review that need to be done. And I think they need to be done collectively. I do come back to the point I made earlier. There's going to be some, you're not going to be based on consensus. The whole idea of the structure post-Second World War, that we are all singing Kumbaya together around the fireplace, doesn't work. We have to start getting those countries, those governments, those people, those organizations together in an affiliated network to start working on these issues, which is now what they're doing in the sustainable development climate change field. How do you take care of the flow? I wouldn't try to stop it. I think What's happening in Europe and Africa is basically illegal, where European countries are specifically paying hard rock leaders, the president of Egypt and Libya and other places, to prevent people from moving, denying them the right to apply for refugee status. So it's a form of illegality. It's a refoulement of the worst kind. And that's become the European Union answer, which is to pay off sort of thuggish governments to stop the flow of people. I'd hate to see that happen here after the kind of historical record that the Americans have established, the Cartagena and other things. But that's going to be the political pressure. And you're right, Andrew, about camps. They don't work. You know, they become a source of just continuous further frustration and grievance and ultimately terrorist activities and others. You put 1 million people in a camp together, you're asking for trouble. So my point is, I think the flows have to be managed. But here's one concept. Again, I just ask you to think about that. Not every country has to contribute in the same way. Some countries can resettle. Some countries can provide money. Some countries can help dig a water system in the Middle East. Others can provide schooling. In other words, there's a kind of almost cap and trade system that you can bring in to providing for a full-scale contribution towards the support of large refugee migrant flows. But we have to work out the way in which we manage that, and that we don't have, although Eduardo is going to fix it for us.
Dr. Stein, over to you. Final word.
I was sharing with some colleagues and some foreign ministers of Andean countries an image that we are confronting like a person with a deep wound in an artery. And all of us have organized ourselves to give blood transfusions. Unless you close the wound, unless you cauterize the wound, the flow will be maintained. This, as the report stresses over and over, requires a political outcome, a political decision, a political solution. My mandate is to stay within the boundaries of the humanitarian agendas. I should not get into a political discussion yet. If we want to really help in a systemic way, there are several things that we should take into consideration. As I said before, and Mr. President-elect of Brazil, Mr. Bolsonaro, in his first declarations to the press, had sent the shivers to all of Latin America because he even contradicts the Inter-American Democratic Charter in many of his statements. So we have to wait and see if indeed he's going to radically change the structure, the agendas, and the procedures in which Brazil has related to the rest of the hemisphere and to the world in such a dramatic fashion. There is a shift towards the right in all of the hemisphere. But in some countries, I would say, is a shift that reflects the frustration of the population with our traditional democratic structures and behavior. That is what we should take into account, as well as the economic agendas. Just the economy won't solve the flow. Even if our countries become rich overnight, they will not solve the flow, because there is a deep political frustration in a lot of sectors of our populations. Thirdly, I would say, as many have mentioned already, there is indeed a temporary status search within the receiving countries. They are looking at mechanisms that are viable, that are readily put into practice, that are efficient, and that are as similar as possible amongst all the countries. And from then onwards, then they could move to naturalization processes. And this requires, of course, very robust digital systems that can be shared amongst all countries with biometric options. Those are costly. But I see people from Inter-American Development Bank, for example, that could help foot the bill. This is the type of efforts that are already on the table, being not only discussed, but outlined and designed. And two last comments. One has to do with the way in which, let me put it this way, the way in which it was mentioned that there is a possibility of a Venezuelan flow through Central America all the way to the US border. Yes, the possibility is there. And we've seen the transnational criminal cartels operating in Central America take sometimes overnight decisions to make havoc within governmental structures. They have the capacity, they have the money, they have the networks that are outside of the law, so they could indeed create corridors almost overnight if they want to make this type of havoc of problems and convert a flow of Venezuelans into another political challenge, not only a humanitarian economic challenge. So it's indeed a collective responsibility from all the countries to respond integrally in a systemic fashion, as we've insisted, and the report insists, to this situation. I hope that you delve into the report. Is really rich in suggestions, and it outlines thinking trends that we need to tackle in creative fashion, but almost all the time it stresses in a collaborative fashion. Thank you very much.
I want to thank again my colleagues here at the dialogue. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I know our panelists are going to stick around for a little while if you want to grab them for follow-up. So again, just want to thank my colleagues at the dialogue, to CG and the World Refugee Council. A great thank you for the collaboration on this project. I want to thank all of you for coming, and please join me in thanking just this extraordinary group of panelists.